So, ich fasse mal zusammen. Wir hatten die fantastischen Frauen. Wir hatten die Female Activists. Dann hatten wir Food, eine Menge zu essen. Dann hatten wir die Publishing Heroes. Und jetzt kommt unser letzter Block für heute, für dieses Programm. Und in diesem Block nehmen wir Sie mit auf eine Reise um die ganze Welt. Im ersten Beitrag nehmen wir Sie mit nach Australien. Und in Australien werden Sie die meisten von Ihnen kennen, Koalabären, Kängurus, aber Australien hat auch eine ziemlich interessante Literaturszene. Die ist nämlich so vielfältig und einzigartig wie die Landschaft dieses riesigen Kontinents. Und direkt im Anschluss Emirates, the New World Order, so heißt das nämlich. Lassen Sie sich in diesem Beitrag in einen anderen Teil der Welt entführen und dort bekommen Sie einen Eindruck, wie die Emirates Literaturstiftung ein Programm ziemlich vielfältiger kultureller Initiativen nicht nur unterstützt, sondern auch fördert. Ein Beitrag, der Ideen über eine ganz neue Weltordnung enthält.
Hi, my name's Trent Dalton. I'm an Australian author. I've come down to a little patch of paradise not too far from my house in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia. This is a little favourite spot for me, a bit of classic Australian bushland that I come to often to dream up ideas for books and think up characters and kind of think about my future as a writer in Australia. And I couldn't think of a better place to introduce this extraordinary panel today that you're about to see, filled with some of Australia's best authors discussing books on Australia and that concept that are we more than just grit and kangaroos? And, you know, for me, I think Australian writing is a bit like this scene you see behind me. You know, yeah, there's darkness and there's dangers that lurk in the bush and there's snakes and there's deadly spiders under the rocks, right? And that's Australia, like it's filled with darkness and our suburbs, right? I've been a journo for 20 years and I know full well our suburbs are filled with that grit. And you go behind closed doors in this country, you'll see some dark stuff. And we're always writing about that. We'll be writing about that for a long time to come. But there's a lot of this stuff too. There's a lot of bright blue sky and there's wonders beyond your wildest imagination, and we write about that as well. And that's the stuff I personally love writing about. It's the light that comes from the dark, and for me, that's Australian writing. But let's hear from these amazing panelists today. Take it away, guys.
G'day everyone and welcome to Australia, and welcome specifically to this conversation about books from Australia. My name is Benjamin Law. I'm an author and broadcaster based here in Sydney, Australia. And the traditional custodians of where I am are the Gadigal of the great Aboriginal nation of Eora. First Nations Australians, like the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, have been sharing stories and sharing knowledge here for tens of thousands of years. In fact, it's the oldest living, continuing civilization that the planet has ever seen. That's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures here. And we are very grateful that we can continue sharing stories and knowledge here on what is and what will always be Aboriginal land. A big thank you to author Trent Dalton for kicking this conversation off from beautiful sunny Queensland. That's originally where I'm from. Now, Trent couldn't be here with us today as he's busy promoting his second novel, All Our Shimmering Skies, which is another gritty offering after his first blockbuster hit, Boy Swallows Universe, which was published by HarperCollins Australia. Now, Australian writing is often described as gritty, and it's also described as honest and brave. And to unpack those descriptions a little bit more, I'm joined by three award-winning Australian authors. First of all, Davina Bell, children's book author, editor and publisher. G'day, Davina.
Hey Ben, how you going?
Good to see you. We've also got Melissa Lukashenko, and she is the award-winning author of many novels, including her latest, the Miles Franklin award-winning novel, Too Much Lit. G'day, Melissa. Good to see you. And finally, last but not least, Gary Disher, a multi-genre author writing across adult crime fiction, young adult fiction, and kids' books. G'day, Gary.
Hi.
Really good to see you. Okay, let's get into the question. The first word that came up when describing Australian books just before was gritty or grit. Grit meaning having a strength of character, being courageous, showing perseverance and resolve. Grit lit is even a term used for Aussie writing right back into the 1990s. And I remember books like Andrew McGann's Praise and a lot of those books coming out in the 90s, like Christos Tsiolkas's Loaded, which have really firmly belonged to that canon. But I want to hear from the panelists. Let's start with you, Melissa. Have you heard of this description of Australian writing before as gritty? And are you consciously writing about the grit of Australian life when it comes to your own stories?
The term grit lit is familiar to me, and yeah, my work is often described with adjectives like hard hitting or even confronting. In a way, I think that's because I write about race and class, and those things, unless they affect your life every day, you are going to find it confronting and gritty to think about. But because I'm an Aboriginal writer, I'm always harking back to a much older tradition. A civilization where life wasn't about struggle and wasn't about survival, but was about thriving and becoming human in this place.
Right now, we find ourselves in 2020 in this global conversation about race and class, and specifically racism. We're starting to get a very strong idea of what that means in, say, the American context. What does that mean in the Australian context, Melissa?
Australia needs to have a long and frank conversation about living on land that was stolen from Aboriginal people. But beyond that, beyond the politics of that, which I do write about, it's about recognising that modern Australia is built on over 100,000 years of human learning. You know, if you look at the recent bushfires and the way that modern Australia has manifestly failed to manage fire on this continent, and yet there are the glimmerings of hope that the society is now ready to understand what Aboriginal people learned here over 100,000 years. It's not rocket science, but it's an ongoing conversation.
Now, Gary, you've been quoted as saying that all stories in films and books have a theme of searching for our home. I feel like that's a very Australian yearning and quest, that search of true home. How does that idea connect to the settings and characters in your crime fiction specifically? And is our true home, when it comes to Australian storytelling, a very gritty reality?
I'd like to deal with that issue of grit first. I don't think it's a national characteristic. I think books may be gritty, but we don't produce a gritty literature because we're Australian, or because we have outbacks, or because we have snakes. A book is gritty if it needs to be gritty. Otherwise, it might be a philosophical book, a gentle book, whatever it might be. Now, I might be called a gritty writer because I write crime novels, and in recent years, they've been crime novels set in the outback. I think a lot of people are getting on that bandwagon, but I feel entitled because I grew up in the outback. I return there once a year when I see my family at Christmas time, although maybe not this year because of the pandemic. I still have family living there. So I'm writing, and it's always exerted a pull on my imagination. So if you like, I'm always returning home when I go back to that location in my books. But it's interesting what Melissa has said about home, about the nation, the long history of Indigenous inhabitation here, because there's a white or European or non-Indigenous anxiety, insecurity about place, about home, about calling a place home.
Aboriginal people especially have this concept of being on country. And I wonder if there's something about our national landscape and the diversity of that landscape that influences our literature to an extent that the land itself is its own character in Australian writing.
Well, geography is destiny, famously. And I think to an extent that's true, Ben, but as I'm listening to the conversation about grit, I'm actually reflecting on the way in which a convict and a genocidal past have led to this kind of so-called grit. Because to me, in the Aboriginal community, we refer to Australia as the colony. Okay, so I'm an Australian writer in the loosest sense, but when I see the Australian flag, it doesn't speak to me. That speaks to me of an alien nation, and one day I hope that we have a new flag. Whereas when I see the Aboriginal flag, that's me. That's what my heart sings about. So this conversation about grit and country, I think a lot of the grittiness, the tenacity, or the kind of mateship in Australian life is born in pretty dark and disturbing tropes about, mateship being the mateship of silence around massacres rather than the mateship of Gallipoli, things like that. So I'm sure that the Australian landscape does find its way into, most Australian literature, but there's still glaring silences there. Australia, Gary's a crime writer, but Australia is a crime scene. Australia's come a long way in the last 10 or 15 years. If you look at the explosion of Aboriginal literature and who's writing and who's winning prizes. But that thirst has been in Europe for a longer period because there's none of the colonial baggage in, say, Germany that there is in Britain or in white Australia. Our stories are heard without the lens of settler guilt in countries outside Australia and Britain. And so, again, the great riches of Aboriginal culture, which are only now becoming uncovered by the different writers, myself and Tony Birch, Tara June Lynch, Uncle Brice Pascoe, all the Aboriginal writers, Kim Scott, Alexis Wright, we are tapping into a tradition that's thousands and thousands and thousands of years old, and we have extraordinary things to say to the world, and yet overseas audiences are listening, which is a great thing, and it's just up to us to take that responsibility to do it justice.
You, Davina, you work in a very different space, and one of your latest books for kids is called All of the Factors of Why I Love Tractors. Now, I'm guessing there's a bit of grit with the gravel of tractor work. Is children's publishing in this country, can there be a grittiness found in the literature there too?
So just to contextualise it for you, Ben, if you think about European kids' literature at one end, that's very allegorical and dark and philosophical and moody. And then at the other end, you've got, say, for example, literature from the US, which is very often kind of moralistic and has a real teaching aspect to it and is quite didactic and really sees its role as to educate young people. Australia sits in this beautiful free midpoint where we're not defined by any particular rules or traditions, and there's a real unique sense that anything goes in Australian kids' literature, and we're encouraged to be innovative and experiment, and there's a real freedom in terms of illustration styles and topics, and a real outward lookingness to Australian kids' literature that I think is uniquely us. So I think the grittiness in Australian kids' books comes from the fact that we are not bound by rules, and in doing so, we are allowed to be really kind of emotionally honest and explorative of a huge range of different topics, and that we're not pinned down by any one tradition or aesthetic.
Melissa, I imagine that overseas readers, when they hear the term Australian writing, various stereotypes might pop into their mind. What's the one thing about Australian writing you'd love international readers to actually know that might actually surprise them?
If the stereotype of Australia is the aggressively heterosexual, heteronormative Crocodile Dundee, I think people might be surprised, by the writings of the Chrissy Neens and the Benjamin Laws and myself and Van Niervens. And Yeah, this kind of kaleidoscope of Black and multicultural and queer writing, the intersection of which is a really fertile place.
Davina, what about for you? When other people hear Australian writing, they might think one thing. What do you think might surprise them about Australian writing?
I think, to be really honest, internationally, when people think about Australian children's books, they are often thinking about Eddie Emu and Kylie Koala on a trip to the Billabong. I think they have a really one note and kind of reductive sense of what Australian children's literature can be. And I think because it's such a diverse tradition here, I think they'd be surprised just by how diverse it is in terms of subject matter and the overarching themes of kind of a sense of humour and cheekiness and subversiveness, but then also the seriousness with which we take our books and our subject matter. So, for example, there's quite a well-known Australian picture book at the moment that's about the blood diamond trade. And then in contrast to that, you have one of the most classic pieces of Australian children's literature, which is called The Day My Bum Went Psycho. So there's really just such a breadth in the material. There's really a book for every kind of reader. And I think people would really be surprised by the specificity of our stories and just how different they are. And also, I would love them to become better acquainted with our First Nations publishing. And we have a fantastic children's publishing house called Magabala, who have been around for about 20 years sharing First Nations stories. And then also all the Australian major children's publishing houses are really trying now to promote First Nations voices and illustrators and to really include them as part of the Australian publishing scene, because as Melissa was alluding to, it's 100,000 years of culture and rich narrative storytelling that we've got to share. So yeah, I would love overseas readers to look beyond Kylie Koala. There is so much more there.
Okay, I want to drill into that question even more specifically, and I'll start with you, Gary. But if you were encountering a non-Australian avid reader and you wanted to give them one specific title that might actually challenge and delight them and reframe what Australian writing is, what book would you give them and why?
Well, I think probably Melissa's book.
That was a good answer.
Great answer.
Because the few times that I've made author tours overseas, I've had a sense of Europeans thinking Australia is desert country, the grit factor again, not aware of urban literature, not aware of kids' books, queer literature, or any of those varieties. And turning that around, stemming from something Davina was talking about earlier, I think Australians themselves are more comfortable now with reading about Australia. I think there was a period of a cultural cringe that if it was Australian, it wasn't good enough. And I think there was an embarrassment too about Australian books going overseas, that we would let the side down, that they weren't good enough. But all that's disappearing now, and I think there's an enormous diversity of terrific books that Australians are enjoying, let alone Europeans now.
Melissa, I'm going to ask you the same question, but I'm not going to allow you to nominate your own book, unfortunately. It already has been. What book are you going to give an overseas reader to delight them, but also perhaps reframe what Australian writing looks like to them?
I'd recommend The Greatest Estate on Earth by Professor Bill Gammage, which is a revolutionary book of looking at country and what country is in Australia, what was created here pre-Cook, and the way civilisation and democracy flourished in Australia unbeknownst to the world for thousands and thousands of years. Bill Gammage spent 30 years writing that book, and I think it really shows in what he's produced. It's an absolutely revolutionary text about what Australia is as opposed to what people think it is.
And Davina, I know it's a challenging question, but one book that you're going to give to an overseas reader, what is it?
I think if it's from the canon of Australian children's literature, I would say Looking for Alibrandi. So it's a young adult novel, and it's just as filled with yearning and romance and angst and school dramas as the best YA in the world, but also central to the plotline is the experience of being from an Italian migrant family, a post-war Italian migrant family, and how the secrets and difficulties of that heritage shapes a girl's life and identity. And I think it's got the humour and the funniness and the kind of cheeky sense that a lot of good Australian kids literature has, but it also has tragedy and a lot of heart and emotion, and it's quite a nuanced book as well, and it's beautifully written. So I would hand them Looking for Alibrandi by Melina Marchetta.
Now, we're about to wrap up, but we still have our global audience with us, and this is our final chance to give them our elevator pitch about why, if they were in a bookshop full of international literature, why they should choose an Australian book. Davina, I'm going to start with you because you work in publishing. This should be an easy task. What is your elevator pitch about why people should pick up an Australian book?
If you are looking for a reading experience for a child that is smart, bright, funny, filled with humour and also heart, that will make them think and make them feel, open their eyes to the rest of the world, and in doing so give them an insight into their own selves and hearts, I would pick up a book by an Australian author or illustrator for young people and prepare to feel the sense of yourself expand.
And a big thank you to our panellists, Davina Bell, Melissa Lukashenko, and Gary Disher. Thank you so much, everyone. You can learn more about Books from Australia generally by heading to the website booksfromaustralia.com. Cheers, everyone.
On behalf of the Emirates Literature Foundation and the Emirates Airline Festival of Literature, a very warm welcome to you all. We are delighted to be a part of the Frankfurt Book Fair digital programming and that you are able to join us on this conversation about the New World Order in a post-pandemic world. And without further ado, please allow me to introduce our speakers for today. Professor of World History at Oxford University, Peter Frankopan, exploring a transformed post-pandemic world with author and Assistant Minister of Public and Cultural Diplomacy of the UAE, Mr. Omar Seyfigh-Bash. Peter and Omar.
Nice to see you all, and lovely to see you, Omar. Tell me, how's life been these last few months?
It's been a lot of fun. It's been very interesting. I've just come back from a short trip to Switzerland, where I was on a sports diplomacy trip. It's been a few months since we last spoke, and I have a question for you. I think we were very worried about the way in which COVID was affecting ties and relations and communications. The world hasn't collapsed. Africa hasn't collapsed. Europe hasn't collapsed. The US is doing, is in an interesting space, to say the least. And China seems to be ahead of everybody else. How do you see things?
Well, I think what's interesting about pandemics generally is obviously we've got to work our way through vaccinations and getting the world back on its feet. And that's going to present all sorts of different challenges and complexities. But quite often what happens when you have this kind of moment of both enforced standing still, but also drawing breath, you see a chance for real reconfigurations. You see a chance for new links, new ties. You see a chance for new emergences of we're talking about a new global order. And to some extent, some of those themes were bubbling before the world started to shut down earlier this year. And the pandemic has given a chance in some cases to accelerate some of those. So the emerging relationship between China and the United States is going to be the big global issue of the next decade and beyond. But clearly the role that's being played by Russia, the role that EU has, but also how the Middle East is being reconfigured right now, has a context before 2020, but pandemic perhaps has given some impetus for new directions. And in your part of the world, Omar, this has been a momentous last few weeks. I mean, is that how you've seen it? Do you think that the reconfiguration and the opening up of relations, which people have been waiting and hoping for many decades, and suddenly there's been a real change, is that driven by the pandemic, or is that would that have happened anyway?
I think it would have happened anyway, and that's what we've heard, at least from leadership, that it was going to be a year or two. And there have been a lot of discussions amongst my level of government staff about what exactly did happen. We know that over the years there have been these interactions at the security level, and they're very, very faintly on the fringes of the political. And there've then been the odd sort of discussions on diamond trade, for example. And it does. A lot of people have raised the question whether the pandemic forced a number of strategic changes at the level of government organization. And I remember when we spoke last, we were talking about what small governments, small countries can do, or medium-sized countries can do. And it seems that we really have taken the opportunity of the coronavirus epidemic or pandemic to realign our government according to much more strategic objectives than perhaps we were used to pre-COVID. And there's been a move much more towards our specific economic, social, cultural, and health interests, as opposed to the attention that we used to pay to much broader issues of Arab nationalism, the Palestinian issue, and sort of more global Islamic issues. And so I think actually what we've seen with the recognition of Israel and the coming signing of peace with Israel is a focus on really what it is to be a sovereign state in the Middle East and sovereign state in the Arab world, where you really focus on building your own base before pledging any loyalties to other interests.
But is your view also that the pandemic has given, because we've been trapped indoors or had lower levels of personal engagement, that we have better chances for strategizing, for thinking through? And actually that's quite a positive thing globally, because states and countries are not just reacting to today's news. They're getting a chance to stop and think and work out these very, very tricky questions about their own national economies, the global economy that's going to need a real cardiac massage to get back going again. Has that been your experience?
I think that's a superb question. I think I can definitely say about the UAE that we have taken an opportunity to stop all the travel and all the meetings that we used to attend and really think about what it is that our interests are and how to express those interests. One of the things that I thought was interesting also was the fact that we have taken much more of a science-based approach to government work. And I don't know if you know, but we're actually working with the Chinese on phase 3 trials here of a vaccine in Abu Dhabi and in the Emirates. And again, I think what we're trying to do is really sort of say, okay, well, we are part of the Arab world, we're part of the Middle East, but we're actually we would like to be engaged in solving global problems, and that's the way in which we're going to do that. There is a calculation going forward as to who stood by us in this time and who didn't. And it's very interesting to see that. So countries that have been more insular, more inward-looking, and more focused on sort of sorting themselves out are going to be categorized as that going forward. And those countries that actually stepped up and responded to our requests for assistance or advice or guidance will also be sort of categorized in that manner.
Well, I'm too diplomatic in this forum to ask who's on the no-fly list, but that's a very interesting observation. I think that's right. I think, as we all know, in social settings or whenever we need our friends, some friends step up and some less so, and it's very revealing, I think, when the fog of daily business is taken away, to be able to see who's able to get stuck in and how and why. And in fact, one of my observations, I think, is that this is an almost unprecedented moment because everybody's having because the collapse in energy prices, infrastructure investment has ground to standstill, although the cost of capital is still low. Actually keeping jobs going has been very difficult. As you said, lots of people looking to China because they're more or less, from what we can tell, COVID-free and have managed it out of the system, where we're still catching up here in the West. But it's really given a chance to focus the minds on how do we work together better? How do we find a way of putting... And not just them. No one's typically not trying to get in each other's way, but how do we actually really invest in our civil servants? How do we really get rid of some of these problems and get things moving? Whether it's speeds of border crossing, or whether it's more collaboration in practical nitty gritty. And health is obviously a key part of that. Tell me about the health side of things in in the UAE?
I mean, the UAE continues to spend a huge amount of money on providing services to countries that are in need. So there's a lot of stuff going out to sort of African countries and Middle Eastern countries, and even Central Asian countries. So we're providing that help. In terms of a vaccine, fingers crossed, we're all hoping that all of these vaccines will work out. I'm absolutely certain that the UAE, if able to procure a vaccine, will provide it to as many people as possible. It's just part of the DNA of the Emirates, and in particular the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. That's the kind of thing that we would do.
There's a lot of chat in the kind of the policy think tank world of a new world of China on the one hand, the United States on the other, Europe somewhere in the middle, and then Africa and other parts of Asia either being squeezed and forced to take sides. Or is that a world that you recognize, or is that all oversimplified Beltway or think tank politics where it doesn't reflect the reality?
I mean, there is a certain amount of pressure, obviously, going between the Emirates, between the Americans and the Chinese over sort of 5G telecommunications. So that is an issue. But at the same time, we are able to at least sort of stand up and say, well, okay, if we're not going to take it from the Chinese, what is the alternative? Can you provide an alternative? So I mean, at least we have that level of confidence in our relationship with the Americans to be able to say, we're happy to work with our partners. We're happy to work with our traditional allies. But, we also have economic imperatives that we need to fulfill. If you look at this budding relationship with the Israelis, I think you have to look at it in that context as well, which is that, we've turned turned essentially away from a certain set of traditional Arab concerns and Muslim concerns or Islamic concerns. And we've said we're interested in actually not particularly the political aspect of a relationship with Israel, but we're interested in the technological, the educational, the cultural, and the medical. You'll have seen that the first deal that was done between an Emirati company and an Israeli company was around COVID. That's really the focus. So we're taking kind of a non-ideological approach to these things. And we believe that in the long run, even our closest partners will understand why it is that we're taking these positions. And we hope that, in any kind of sort of tug of war between the Chinese and the Americans, that the Americans would understand why we might, sort of still use or rely on Chinese in certain spheres. But also, I think obviously it's going to be related to what happens with the elections in November. There may be, if there's a change, then there might be a change in positioning on these issues. But then you might have a deeper understanding of that relationship and whether it's structural as opposed to being sort of personality driven.
Yeah, I think it's more complex than just the personality.
Yeah.
The personalities that always tend to magnify issues and problems. So I think that it is going to be key how that relationship works out. And it seems to me that there are lots of different elements that are perfectly reasonable for the US to be trying to bring China to the table and vice versa.
Of course,
but it's not easy, these kinds of transitions as states as big and as populous and with capacity rise at that speed, and trying to find a way of handling that on both sides. One question I got then, Omar, for you, because is as you say, we're all hoping all these vaccines work and that we're all up and running as we used to be, and the trend of the global nomads that you and I both are, be quite nice. Get back in.
To start that off again, yes.
Never thought I was going to miss airports or airplane food. But the next really big thing that's coming towards us all that requires strategy is issues of climate. You in the Middle East and the UAE in particular have an obvious exposure because of your temperature, your latitude, and so on. Can you tell us a little bit about how to prepare, how to think through mitigation, how to think through these kind of really big picture stuff that requires multi-year thought and investment? What's your view on that?
That Abu Dhabi in particular has taken a very strong stand on renewable energy. There is this big push within the Emirate of Abu Dhabi and actually more broadly across the Emirates as a whole to focus on renewable energy. Even though we do recognize, so much of our income comes from hydrocarbons, there is a focus in government to bring our reliance on hydrocarbons down to zero. We've got our renewable energies project, Mustard, which has been working, I think it's probably 14, 15 years now, on investing right across the region in solar energy.
And then one thing which I always ask you about is about education, about the cultural side. I mean, we're talking in Frankfurt Book Fair. How about that side of things, both in the UAE, but also globally, how you see issues about freedoms of speech, about education, about the next generation being able to be informed of better citizens, to be able to know more about the world they're dealing with, and opening up ideas about tolerance. How do you see that? Has the pandemic made a difference to that, or are we going in the right direction anyway?
You know, one of the interesting things I found, I mean, because it's so topical and it's so present in my mind, peace with Israel, the number of young men and women who got in touch with me saying, I want to be, sort of posted there, I want to visit. A number of them have asked me where they can get online or where they can find the closest ulpan to study Hebrew. So actually, I think, there's a tremendous amount of interest. Also, there's been a lot of outreach from the Israelis, educational institutions in particular, who are very interested, educational and cultural, who are very interested in connecting with the Emirates. There is this, by actually saying, listen, we're interested in talking, all of a sudden a tremendous set of opportunities open up. And that in itself is very exciting. It builds, it works within the overall framework of tolerance that we've been talking about for a number of years now in the Emirates. And it really says that we put our money where our mouth is. This is not paying lip service to an ideal, and it's not a PR event. It's actually something real and deep. And it'll be very interesting to see where this takes us in the next few years. And you talk of freedom of speech. Well, the fact that we made peace with Israel, it's going to be very interesting to see how this changes the way in which we look at the world and our youth. Before you have freedom of speech, you have freedom of thought, and demolishing these taboos is going to have a very interesting, and I'd say hopefully a positive effect on the way in which we look at the world. Peace with Israel was an impossibility even to think about in a few years ago and a few months ago. And all of a sudden it's possible, it's real, it's happening. That, you can have a situation where there was absolutely no hope, and all of a sudden there's a tremendous amount of excitement.
I think it's exactly right. And I mean, with both students here at Oxford, but also as a father, you see how open-minded young people are, particularly as they get older and learn how to walk, talk, and express themselves, and how they are and willing they are to inform themselves about the world. And my concern about COVID is that they're the ones who carry the brunt of what goes wrong, both because they have the challenge of the job market, the fact that they have, of course, smaller places to live if they can live on their own anyway, and now there is the economic price to pay, which hopefully, if we get back up and running quickly, society catches up. And
well, my understanding was that because of global debt and the pension systems, the young were going to carry everything anyway, even without COVID. So,
there's more.
I suppose it just can't get much worse.
But they're the ones who are bright, smiling, and so on. But I think we've got to get through this first before anything else goes wrong, and vaccination is the only way to do that. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. But listen, Omar, it's terrific always to speak to you. I suspect, and I'm sure that once we are back and up in the air and meeting in person, that new world order we've been talking about will start to crystallize in different kinds of ways. As we're all on pause now, there are lots of these moving parts behind that we should be paying a lot of attention to. But it's fantastic, I think, to see both, but to see you, of course, but to see how positive you are about changing the Middle East, but also that there's a lot more that's positive and that's good news in all of this that we should be trying to think through rather than being scared and worried. Because as we all know, defensive positions lead to make negative choices, which is part of the problem too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I find it interesting because I remember that we were talking about the way in which small states operate and the way in which the Emirates is perhaps slightly different from, well, the Gulf states in general, I'd say, are slightly different from the more traditional Arab countries, the traditional powers. The fact that, we are much more based in the present and looking to the future allows us to chart a very different course. And I think, to a certain extent, it's important to understand this, that the old guard of the Palestinian leadership perhaps misunderstood the changes that took place over the last 20 years in the Gulf states. And that, the Gulf states are a dynamic set of states, different and similar in many ways. But really that they should have taken much more account of what it is that we're thinking and what it is that we're saying. We're looking forward to a really very bright and hopeful future. And it's really great to see you. And can I ask you, where did you get your sunhat?
Oh, Well, amazingly, I know nobody believes me, in England, every now and again the sun comes out.
Yeah,
And the good news about not being allowed into the libraries is that I read, and so I'm amazingly I'm also able to read outside. So it's good old-fashioned sitting outside by an apple tree, reading a lot and thinking a lot. But I'm embarrassed because scholars should have no suntan at all because it shows they're always deep work, collecting books in the bowels of a library. But I haven't been able to because our wonderful resources here in Oxford have been closed. They're open now. But yeah, I'm afraid I haven't been traveling anywhere.
Good.
But listen, Emma, lovely to see you. I hope to catch up soon in real life. And thank you for your candor and your eloquence as always today. And thank you for
your time. Thank you for your questions. And thank you for this opportunity to see you again.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Peter and Omar, for that fascinating discussion. If you enjoyed that talk, there's more where that came from on the Emirates Literature Foundation YouTube channel. Join us there. And join us in Dubai in February of 2021 for the Emirates Airline Festival of Literature.
Herzlich willkommen hier zurück im Studio 2 in Frankfurt. Ich nehme Sie jetzt nochmal mit auf eine Reise um die ganze Welt, würde ich sagen. Naja, um die halbe Welt. Wenn es um das Verlagswesen und die Literatur, ganz besonders in Afrika geht, da wissen wir in der westlichen Welt eigentlich nicht so viel darüber. In unserem ersten Beitrag lernen Sie einen der ganz wenigen Verleger in Afrika kennen, nämlich in Mosambik, der im literarischen Verlagswesen arbeitet und er sozusagen erfahren hat, wie die Europäischen Literaturinstitute das Wachstum der afrikanischen Literaturindustrien unterstützen können. Im Anschluss dann unser zweiter Beitrag, und zwar die Karadi Tales. Die Autorinnen, Verlag Karadi Tales, die Autorinnen Prabha Ram und Sheila Preuit, so spreche ich es mal auf, kommen beide aus Indien und Indien ist ja ein Subkontinent mit offiziellen 24 Sprachen und einer enormen Vielfalt an ethnischen Gruppen. Und diese Vielfalt betrifft eigentlich so gut wie jeden vor Ort und das ist in Indien eine ganz besonders große Herausforderung. Karadi Tales ist ein unabhängiger Kinderverlag mit Sitz in Chennai, der sich in erster Linie auf Bilderbücher und Hörbücher spezialisiert hat. Und im dritten Beitrag geht es dann nach Indonesien. Da geht es auch um Kinderbücher. Indonesien ist das größte Land Südostasiens und hat ein ziemlich großes und äußerst vielfältiges Erbe, nämlich 17.000 Inseln. Die Kinderbuchbranche nimmt auch dort Fahrt auf und vor allem die sehr junge Bevölkerung freut sich darüber, diese einzigartige Palette der indonesischen Kinderbuchillustrationen und Illustratoren im eigenen Land zu haben. Sie merken schon, es sind doch einige Stunden jetzt her, lässt auch ein bisschen die Konzentration nach, aber ich hoffe, Sie sind noch mit uns dabei, denn am Ende gibt es noch einen Beitrag aus Taiwan. Und zwar Taiwan, das ist die großartige Verlagsindustrie in Taiwan noch stärker zu fördern oder um sie noch stärker zu fördern, wurde vor kurzem TAICA, die Taiwan Creative Content Agency, gegründet. Wir werden gleich in dem letzten, vierten Beitrag eine Menge von Geschichtenproduktionen und innovative Geschichtenproduktionen und Autorinnen und Autoren sehen. Eine Stunde, 20 Minuten, 4 Beiträge um die ganze Welt. Mir bleibt eigentlich nur noch Ihnen viel Spaß zu wünschen bei den folgenden Beiträgen. Mein Name ist Hatice Akian und es war mir eine ganz große Freude, hier die letzten 4-5 Stunden durch das Programm zu führen. Im Anschluss um 16 Uhr ist dann meine großartige Kollegin Bärbel Schäfer hier zur Stelle und wird Sie dann durch das weitere Programm führen. Mir hat es eine Menge Spaß gemacht und bis hoffentlich ganz bald. Naja, nicht digital, das müssen wir uns nicht wünschen, aber sehr gerne wieder hier auf der Frankfurter Buchmesse von Angesicht zu Angesicht. Ich würde mich sehr freuen. Bleiben Sie gesund. Tschüss.
Hello and welcome to this special edition of Tele Talks for the Frankfurt Book Fair, BOOKFEST Digital. I'm Jasmus Cassinda, Managing Director of Mozambican publishing house Etale Publishing. My guest today is James Murua, literary blogger, writer and journalist from Nairobi, Kenya. James, welcome.
Thank you, Jasmus. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for having me on your on this talks. I'm really excited. I've been following them, and I know that they're really, really useful talks. So thank you to you and your team, and thank you for those who are streaming in and watching wherever they might be.
Today, we are going to be discussing how European literary institutes and publishers can strengthen collaboration with African literary industry, recent growth in literacy levels, internet penetration, and literary industries in general present an opportunity to strengthen collaboration. So, James, here is my first question. What are the most exciting developments today in African literary industries that you follow?
So the question you ask is about exciting developments. And there have been many exciting developments. One of the most important of these developments is the way that the industries have been networking together in ways that have never happened in the past. In the past, we had people who are in their little silos, developing their little book industries. But in the last decade or so, there have been more cross collaborations between people as they do festivals, as they do anthologies, as they do literary prizes. And I think that's the most exciting part of the exciting new development, because we are seeing festivals like the Ake Festival, which in 10 years before would never have had, would have had just Anglophone writers and maybe one or two from other language families, but now we have, a mix of more. So I think the collaborations between the African literary communities is the most important development, in my opinion.
Is there more collaboration now across the continent than before?
Yes, it's the collaboration. The collaboration we're seeing now is unprecedented, and it's been driven by technology. We have social media, we have digital media, and this allows people to communicate easier and faster. And for those who might have had a problem communicating, most of this social media has translation services, so you don't need to have you don't need to speak French or Portuguese or even German. If somebody sends you a message, there's a way of translating it over the internet easier. So these are some of the things that have fueled the new communication between people across the continent within the language groups, and even within the groups within the community. Like, so even within Anglo-Africa, or even within Lusophone Africa, there are people who aren't speaking, but with the technology, they're able to communicate and get their ideas across.
What challenge remain in the literary industry?
The main challenge is we really don't know what a literary industry for a continent as big as Africa should be. It's a huge continent with 53, 54, 55 countries, depending on who you're asking. There are over 2,000 languages spoken on this continent. Although we always speak about the European languages, but they are not even by far. Like, there are very many languages spoken on this continent. There are many challenges of trade. So you find, if for instance I was to publish my book here in Kenya, it would be easier for me to send it to Europe and then send it to Lagos, to Somaliland. It would be easier for me to send it to Somaliland via London than to send it from Nairobi to Hargeisa. So there are barriers, physical barriers, there are tariff barriers, there are language barriers. So there's still a lot of challenges right now. So while we want to say that there has been progress, and there has been a lot of progress, the challenges are still there. The barriers are still there, and they need to be surmounted for the industry to grow.
I would like to ask you what European institution can do to support African literature or African literary industry development.
Number one thing for me, of course, money helps. A lot of the things.
It's a question of investment.
Are running on low budgets, so you're looking for organizations that are looking for donations, for funding, to continue in their own, objectives. So, I mean, I have magazines, I have publishing houses, I know of bloggers, and a lot of them have to self-fund a lot of these activities. So considering to donate to these organizations is one. Another option is to give options for training, either in the technical aspects of the business they're in. A lot of people don't have like a lot of people, we don't have very many good editors for manuscripts, for instance. So you always need good editors. You always need people who know how to write better. So there are things like that, technical assistance for the people who on the ground who will be doing this work. And then, of course, another aspect which would be interesting for me, it's something I've been thinking about, is you find that people who are in Anglophone world don't speak French or Portuguese or Spanish or German. And people who are in Europe, if the Europeans would teach them their languages. So if I'm speaking English and then somebody says, okay, we're going to teach you French, it'll go a long way to helping integrate other people. So share the languages you have. We'll worry about our own languages. But if you get to share your language, that's another way. So those are some of the ways. There are very many ways. So donations, technical assistance, so fellowships for the people who are trying to do the work that needs to be done. And then, of course, share your languages. And by share your languages, I'm talking about the major languages. So people in what is considered Francophone Africa, I'm sure they would not complain too much if they're taught there are opportunities to learn English, and get opportunities in English. And yeah. Oh, and last one, translators are very important people in this industry. So if you can get the translators to we get more and more translators, you don't need as many people to speak the language. The translators will translate the texts.
What different institutions can do in terms of digital infrastructure?
That's a really difficult question, because there's a physical infrastructure of producing books or producing, different titles. And most countries have different ways of handling that. In one country, like let's say Nigeria, they really encourage printing locally. In Kenya, you can easily produce out of the country and import it because it's cheaper. So there is no one way that you can help with the physical infrastructure that I can think of. This is actually a new one. It's country by country. You go to this country. I think the South Africans are printing very well at reasonable costs. So the physical infrastructure, you have to go country by country because everybody has a different and unique way. You know, their industries are unique and different. Some are bigger, some are just, you know, some is a cottage industry. It's not a big industry. On the digital side, I always believe that one of the problems we have is while we want to help, what we want to do is we want to use the infrastructure that's already there. Unless before you get to the advanced level of, say, we want people to start doing their own work. Like I develop websites before I started writing, so I'm better placed to do that kind of work. So on the side of the digital infrastructure, if you can find a way of tapping into whatever people are already using, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Instagram, whether it's Twitter, whether it's Wattpad, there are already platforms that are being used. And I actually would suggest that instead of thinking of getting them from that, getting a new platform, you need to go and get them where they are and get them from there. So I really like Wattpad. Wattpad is a platform where a lot of African writers are actually producing work, and it goes nowhere. So this is one of the ways to really think about that one is, you know, go into Wattpad, look for the African writers. And, you know, if there are people who are really exciting, you want to offer them, you're not going to give them a manuscript deal, but you can say, okay, why don't you submit to one of my journals here in some of the journals that are known. And that's how you develop the society. So go where the people are, and then develop them from there.
Okay. James, do you think that African literature represents a commercial opportunity for European publishers?
Short answer, yes. There is an opportunity here. A lot of people like thinking that because we are all now very digital savvy and we are all using social media and we are doing all these things, a lot of Africans do not have these things. It's not as mainstream as we want to imagine, number one. And there's a lot of people who would be interested in getting these books, these products, these literary products. And even those who have those devices, if the devices are available and the content that is being produced is in line with the aspirations of the people of the space. So I'm in Kenya. If I'm going to read a story about somebody who was in Kenya, you know, like there's a story that was written by a Kenyan blogger called the Uber driver, and it went viral very quickly because this young man wrote a story about the things that many people in Kenya are familiar with, and it became actually it also went across the continent because we are all familiar with, you know, an Uber driver and the adventures, the things that go around that. So if the content is available and it's easily it's able to be distributed to the people, they will consume it. So the opportunities are there. The opportunities are in the devices, getting the devices to the people, because as much as we have done a lot of work in the last 10, 15 years to spread devices and do a lot, there's still very few low-cost devices available across the continent. Devices, and then not just devices, but the books themselves. As long as you're able to get books which have content that deals with people's aspirations, they will get these books. So opportunities are there. You need to be smart, you need to be patient. The reward will be at the end.
Okay, and those opportunities includes books written in African languages?
Those are actually really that's a really big space. The Nigerians have a long tradition of Hausa literature. We have literature in East Africa, Kiswahili literature. So those African languages, they are opportunities. So I know, for instance, I've been following the coastal region of Kenya, and Kiswahili is blowing up as a language partly because of Kiswahili blowing up as a language across the continent and across the world. There's suddenly a need for more Kiswahili books, Kiswahili poetry, Kiswahili essays. So the opportunities are growing every day. I mean, a colleague told me how somebody who was a translator suddenly has too much work. They have to keep they can't keep up with the demand for their work. So the languages are also an opportunity. So the opportunities are many, whether it's in the languages, whether it's in the infrastructure. The thing that we have is, unfortunately, the industry of publishing in Kenya, in Africa, the whole of the continent, has been severely underfunded for a generation. So whoever would come in would actually be coming in an industry that needs it's with the lack of funding. Anybody who comes in early will get the early movers advantage. There's a lot to be had from that. My final word is thank you for having me. I'm always excited to talk with other African writing professionals and for publishing professionals. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you to the Frankfurt Book Fair. And hello everybody in the audience. I'm hoping you're having a nice day, and have a nice one.
Thank you, James. There is so much more to discuss, but unfortunately, our time is already up. I hope our viewers enjoyed these special editions of Etale Talks as much as I did. For more details on Etale Talks, you can follow Etale Publishing on Facebook or Twitter or on our Facebook. All that remains for me to say is thank you, James Murua. Thank you, Frankfurt Book Fair, and thank you to everybody watching. Goodbye and stay safe.
Hot tuppa, hearty chunky tuppa, yummy spicy tuppa. Hi, I'm Prabha Ram.
And I'm Sheila Pruitt. We're the co-authors of Tukpa for All by Karadi Tales.
We're so excited to be part of the Digital Book Fest.
Prabha Ram and Sheila Pruitt love stories of all sorts. When they're not seeking wisdom from their fuzzy-tailed feline friends, their other pursuits include concocting soups from varied cuisines, growing seasonal vegetables, and supporting childhood literacy in their communities.
Hi, I'm Prabha Ram, co-author of Tukpa for All. Tukpa for All is my 11th book for children. I enjoy writing stories of all different kinds for kids, essentially stories that are perspective broadening and horizon expanding, so children get to see a world different from their own. I enjoy writing both fiction and non-fiction. In non-fiction, themes of wildlife and nature excite me. I've written a couple of books about the endangered animals of India, and a picture book on Asiatic lions and river dolphins of India. Stories excite me, and all kinds. I've written about crafts of India and cats and shapes and trees, a counting book, a concept book about trees of India. Earlier in 2006, I started a blog to feature inclusive and diverse narratives and underrepresented regions and stories of the world. This was mainly to showcase stories that you don't really hear about in the mainstream. I also conduct art appreciation workshops at a neighborhood art gallery and reading aloud sessions, book clubs and storytelling workshops for children, especially ones that are first generation readers. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sheila Pruitt, co-author of Tukpa for All. I write both fiction and non-fiction books for children. Stories that are set in lesser-known parts of the world, especially in communities that are so different from what I grew up in, those are my favorites. At the same time, stories that feature inclusive narratives and embrace the diversity in our world, they inspire me. They give me hope for a peaceful future. I enjoy writing non-fiction books for children on STEM topics, particularly about our natural world, as well as some books on computer science. I could spend hours watching the drama unfolding in my backyard when the woodpeckers and chickadees and house finches and hummingbirds, they just dart back and forth creating such a racket. It's just beautiful. I'm such a chronic picture taker. I would just sneak up on these birds and I could just take pictures all day long. It's this biodiversity, it's this beauty in our world that always inspires me. I just want to bring all this joy to the kids through picture books. Writing Tukpa for All with Prabha Ram has been such a fabulous experience. We're so excited to share this book with you.
It's always nice to write a story about children's experiences from different parts of the world. The setting for the book Tukpa for All is Ladakh, and the story is told from a blind child's perspective. Ladakh is a high-altitude, cold desert with austere monasteries. Very little grows here, and the Ladakhis are careful about not wasting food. One-pot meals are a characteristic feature in the cuisine of Ladakh, and a bowl of tukpa can be very comforting in the coldness of the place. Ladakh is also underrepresented in children's books, and we wanted to tell the story of Sering and his community, his neighbors and friends, all coming together, and the making of Tukpa takes the center stage.
Sering loves the promise each day brings. He shines with positivity. He surely brings a smile to everyone he encounters. He is blind, but that does not limit him much. His family and the immediate community help him carry on just fine. He is able to navigate his environment independently, and he cares about the members in his neighborhood. He helps his grandma routinely with the chores, so much so that his grandma confidently and matter-of-factly just sends him to the garden to pick a basket of peas for supper. As Sering diligently feels each pea pod with his fingers and teases out the peas, we are filled with a profound sense of warmth. Let's jump into the book to meet Sering in beautiful Ladakh. Tukpa for All.
Gong rings the gong at the gompa. Sering perks up and sets off home. Tick-tock. Sering treks with his stick, sweeping it left and right. His taste buds tingle. Abby's noodle soup beckons. He hums, hot, hot tukpa, hearty, chunky tukpa, yummy, spicy tukpa. Flap, thwap, prayer flags flutter. Sering moves faster, tapping the stick as he walks. Jure, my friend, what's the hurry? Asks Rickson, making way for Sering. Going home for Abby's tukpa, the best tukpa in town, answers Sering brightly. Sounds delicious, says Rickson longingly. Would you like to join us? Invites Sering. Sure, I'll be there, shouts Rickson. Crook, crunch. Sering walks down the familiar gravel trail. Ba, ba! A lamb bleats in his path. Molu, did you sneak off from Tashi uncle's patch again? He asks, picking her up and stroking her fur. There is my wandering sheep, says Tashi uncle, gathering little Molu in his arms. You always bring her back, Sering. Thank you, he says, guiding him back to the trail. As he walks away, Sering calls out, It's been a long time since you visited us, uncle. Abby is making tuppa tonight. Please come. I would love to. Tell Abby I'll be there, replies Tashi uncle.
Gurgle burble, almost home, thinks Sering. Julay, Sering, what's the hurry? Calls out Nima auntie from the washing stream. Abby's tuppa, auntie. Come have dinner with us. Abby will be glad to see you, replies Sering. I'll be there, Sering, assures Nima auntie. Cough, sniffle. It is his neighbor Norbu. Your cough sounds worse, Nimi, says Sering. Abby's tuppa will make it better. Come have some this evening. Yes, it will. I will see you in a few hours, says Norbu. Crook, crook. Abby is working in the garden. Abile, I told Rigzin that your tuppa is the best. He is coming to eat with us tonight, declared Sering. Rigzin is always welcome, smiles Abby. Oh, by the way, Tashi uncle and Nima auntie are coming too, and Norbu Mimi as well, adds Sering excitedly. All of them? For tonight? My dear boy, we need more water, vegetables and noodles too. Let me see what I can do. Abby starts bustling around. Bring me some peas for the soup, she adds, handing Sering a basket.
Sering invites more and more people to come and have tuppa at his house that evening. Find out what happens when all of them show up that evening, and suddenly the lights go out, just as Grandma is about to cook the tuppa.
Do you want to have some tuppa? Try the recipe in the book.
Tuppa for All by Prabha Ram and Sheila Pruitt. Illustrated by Shilpa Ranade.
Sheila and I are passionate about sharing inclusive narratives and community stories. We loved working on the story Tuppa for All, that, as you know, features a young boy who happens to be blind. The story revolves around a tightly knit community. It is not about Sering's disability. In fact, it is quite the opposite. It is about his ability, the things he loves to do and share, and his love for his grandmother's tasty and sumptuous tuppa, which he was very keen on sharing with the people that mattered to him. His vision impairment doesn't stop him from having a great time with his neighborhood friends, and especially his grandmother when he offers to help her. It is a story where everyone comes together to create a delicious meal. Food, sharing, and community bonding are the key focus. Knowing that inclusivity and diversity need to pervade the literary landscape, we were very excited that Tuppa for All came out so seamlessly and with so much love from Shobha Vishwanath and the entire Karadi Tales team. The illustrations by Shilpa Ranade brings lots of warmth and heart to the story. The trend to bring more inclusive stories is definitely on the rise, which makes us feel hopeful for a vibrant literary landscape.
Gong rings the gong at the gompa. Tick, tock, Sering walks with his stick. Flap, twap, the prayer flags flutter. Crunch, Sering walks down the gravel track. Ba, ba, a lamb bleats. Gurgle, burble, almost home, thinks Sering. Cough, sniffle, he notices his neighbor who's not well. Tring, tring, he recognizes his friend Riggson's bicycle bell. Throughout the story, Tsering listens to the sounds around him as he treks to his grandma's house. We used onomatopoeia to give a sense of how Tsering interacts with his environment. We wanted to focus on what Tsering can do rather than what he cannot do, and the use of onomatopoeic sounds was one way we wanted to highlight this aspect. We're so happy that the illustrations by Shilpa Ranade brings warmth and vibrancy to the story. Prabha and I enjoyed working on this book with Shobha Vishwanath and the Karadi Tales team. We hope the book gives the readers a sense of the land, the people, and of the neighborly culture that sustains most small and remote communities. And, most of all, we hope the young readers recognize that Tsering is just a young kid who's brimming with joy, always ready to share what he has.
In the east of the east and the south of the deep lies emeralds in peace, scattered seamlessly. Each sparkles his own flame, flourishes his own green. Each brings his own gene, with more tales in between. About a boy on a journey. Or a girl in a hurry. About a mother longing. Or secrets worth keeping. From tall trees to sprout, embrace without a doubt. With the spirits that towers of a legacy that is ours. Through a wholesome feast, over celebrations of tree. And bound and complete. With all the colors released. When friendship lasts, and hope reach vast, for the dark is cast, and courage surpass. These jewels remain as true and retain its colors and veins to the heart of its name.